So a very pleasant afternoon to one and all. At the very outset, I wish to welcome the management team of our institution, the most respected Chairman Sir, Distinguished Correspondent Ma'am, dignified Technical Director Sir, majestic CEO Sir, and glorious Head of the institution, Dr. Prem Nazir Sir, for approving our proposal and rendering purpose this webinar. I extend my warm welcome to the eminent speaker of the day, Mr. Norman Ronald, who is an acting director of the Center of Quality Promotion and Assurance at the Durban University of Technology in Durban, South Africa. I could say that Norman is the perfect person to talk on today's topic, flexible teaching, learning, assessment, and curriculum provisions in the midst of a pandemic. I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Norman Ronald to the audience, which justifies my statement. Mr. Norman is one of the well-known South African academia for his excellence in the area of quality assurance. The team under Norman performs numerous roles across the spectrum of teaching, learning, assessment, curriculum design, and academic administration as pertains to internal and external quality. The center advises executive management, academic departments, and executive management and faculty members on solving quality issues and designs internal systems. Norman has 25 years of experience in teaching, lecturing, academic administration, curriculum design, and quality assurance. He has studied at the University of Natal and the University of South Africa and obtained the qualifications in mathematics, computer science, and education. Norman has published a number of research papers in international journals as well. Norman's area of research is graduate attributes and employability and the link to teaching, learning, assessment, and curriculum design. With this short introduction, I welcome Mr. Norman to deliver his session. Mr. Norman, the session is yours.
A very good day, colleagues, and I really thank the management and staff for this opportunity to speak to you and to share my thoughts and experiences in light of the current pandemic. So without much further ado, I'm going to start with my presentation, and then I'll add in some information as we progress. I'm going to switch off my mic at this time so we could focus on the presentation. Thank you. I trust that everybody can now see my slideshow. If that's in order, then we can proceed.
Yeah, just a brief. Norman, you can proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, once again, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, I thank you for this opportunity. I was a bit reluctant initially because I thought, what could I actually share with you besides you've experienced yourself and, the backgrounds that you have. But I'm quite pleased to have this opportunity and to speak to you briefly on this topic. I'm not going to actually delve into COVID-19 and the pandemic and the effects thereof, because I think we're well acquainted with that scenario, and we're going to look at my topic as is flexible teaching, learning, assessment, and curriculum provisioning or provisions in the midst of a pandemic. I'm going to move to the next slide. Firstly, as way of a general introduction, what you'll find is that I think you would realize that there might be a bit of a delay between slides, so just bear with us. Firstly, I can work at the Durban University of Technology, and it might be a term that you're not familiar with, so I want to just provide some of the context very quickly. You might ask, what is a University of Technology and what type? Because it's not very common across the world as such. It has been benchmarked with practices internationally, but just to give you some context as to what it means to us. Firstly, in South Africa, there are basically 4 types of higher education institutions. There's what we call traditional universities. They're University of Technology. They are what are called comprehensive universities. And then a large class, these 3 are public universities or university types. And then we have a large class of private institutions. So what does the University of Technology actually do? What do we focus on? How is it similar and how is it different from a traditional university? Firstly, we offer the same kind of qualifications as you would have at any other university. In other words, we offer diplomas, we offer degrees, we offer honors degrees, master's degrees, postgraduate diplomas, and doctoral degrees. We offer them across a wide spectrum of disciplines. The traditional science, engineering, technology, humanities, languages, arts, and then also in particular, for this particular discussion, I want to also mention, we do have a large school which deals with hospitality, catering, hotel management, and also tourism as well. How does a unit compare to other universities? As I said, if you look at the offering types, you will see that it's very much like any other university. We offer in-house. The slight difference that we have is that we tend to focus, not in all disciplines, mind you, we tend to focus quite a bit on applied research and practical applications. In other words, taking the research, taking the teaching, learning, and getting something that we can apply in the practical. That's not to say we don't do blue sky research, traditional research, but we try as far as possible to bring it into the workplace and to make something, maybe a process, make some kind of product or some kind of service. We also tend to focus a fair amount on vocational training. In other words, what is relevant for the workplace? Again, I'm not saying that universities do that, but I'm saying we have a particular focus. We do that deliberately. We make a concerted effort to ensure that our qualifications speaks to the needs of commerce and industry. In particular, as Dr. Chilagabati mentioned, I look at graduate attributes, and especially in terms of the responsiveness of our qualifications to the industry. For those of you that have done research in this area, I look at employability especially. So it's not just employment as such, but the academic term, employability. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Just to give you a quick background about the South African environment, it's a very highly regulated environment. In fact, many of our academics complain that we're over-regulated. Very quickly, we have a Department of Higher Education and Training, which focuses on higher education or tertiary education or university education, if you like. They design legislation, they provide funding, and in many ways, they are the overarching governing body for education, higher education in South Africa. We have the Council on Higher Education, which deals more on the program level with what we call accreditation. In other words, they look at the program, the nuts and bolts, the curriculum, the modules, the credits. Then we have a body called the South African Qualifications Authority, which actually has a central database on which all student records are maintained, as well as a record of all that have been accredited and approved. Lastly, this doesn't apply in every field and disciplines, as you would appreciate. There are what we call professional boards or professional councils. They'll deal primarily with the registration of practitioners, and they don't necessarily apply to every particular discipline. We have the traditional boards, the Engineering Council, the Health Council, the accounting associations, and various others, which I'm not going to go into at this stage. The system that we use is based on the UK, Australian, and New Zealand systems, and to some extent Europe, and a lesser extent the American system. The University of Technology qualification type, by the way. If you want to use an analog, it'll be somewhat like your Indian Institute of Technology, or maybe a bit like MIT and Caltech, very much along those lines. But as I said, we also offer the pure, straightforward, theoretically bound qualifications which deal with arts and education and so on. Just another point in terms of introduction. I mentioned higher education. Very quickly, I'm not going to go into details. There are three bands in which education in South Africa is separated. There's higher education and training, there's further education and training, and general education and training. Very roughly speaking, general education deals with the school system, the traditional school system where we have and people that deal with plumbing, fitting, electrical work and so on, but more on the technical level. And then finally, the higher education band, which I mentioned earlier, with tertiary education, university education as such. I'm going to move to my next slide. Now, within this that I mentioned, we could speak much more about it, but I want to focus on the main today, which is to look at the current circumstances in which we find ourselves and what has South Africa as a country and the Durban University of Technology in particular done to deal with the pandemic and to actually work around it. Firstly, I think the key point is that in circumstances like these, leadership and support are key. And especially, it has to work across. It's not sufficient to just get leadership from the top, but you have to have leadership at the top, but also every intermediate level as well. Now, within South Africa, I think we actually have accomplished that. And I guess many other countries as well, probably India, what we've seen in the news, has adopted a similar approach. I must stress that resourcing and support must underpin leadership. Otherwise, the leadership is toothless and ineffective. In looking at interventions that we design to deal with the pandemic and the circumstances around it, and obviously in our case, we're looking at teaching, learning, assessment, and curriculum, we had to adopt many governing principles in terms of guiding our interventions and the way we work to mitigate the risks and to deal with offering academic programs within the constraints that exist currently. So within South Africa, one of the guiding principles is access for all students. In other words, all across all bands, whether it be higher, further, or we were looking at providing access to all students. A mantra that was used is that no student must be left behind. Whether that's practical, time will only tell. The other key thing is flexibility, and that's one aspect of, I think, just to mention that anything that has been a key principle that we've adopted. The reflexive practices actually speaks to flexibility, the ability to adapt, the ability to look at, as things are, the circumstances are dynamic, things change all the time. In South Africa, we have different lockdown levels and we have different statistics that we monitor. And yes, we might adopt a particular approach, but we're not stuck with that. Also, the other principle is that it must be enabling and supportive. In other words, we don't just give instructions, we don't just issue ultimatums, support, we provide resources, we create an enabling environment. The next point is transparency. Difficult if you look at managing crises, especially because the tendency with many governments, I'm not going to mention any in particular, adopt a more autocratic style of management and governance, which may be necessary in certain cases, but it's something that cannot be sustained in the long term because people, institutions, the penultimate point I want to make, which is quite important for us as well, is that community, volunteerism, and pardon my use of this word here, there's a South African word I'm using that's called Ubuntu, which is actually one of our local languages. And basically the principle refers to, it's a community-based principle. And what it actually means that we're all in it together, we are all one, and we should all work collectively in harmony to accomplish a common goal. And then the last principle I want to mention is we have to keep in mind budgetary constraints. Whilst we want to create solutions and we want to do the best for students, staff, stakeholders, it might not be possible because of financial constraints and budgets in particular. For those of you that want the research bent to this, the South African education system and these principles are based on what is called the social constructivist approach. And you will see that many of these have been adopted within our principles that we've adopted for the interventions. The last point I wanted, if you're looking at technology to mediate solutions, the Durban University of Technology, as the case in point, we've our own sanitizers, which we have provided to the community, we've provided to healthcare workers, and this is creating these sanitizers from scratch using the facilities that we have. And also providing sanitizers for every student and for the staff members as well. Another part of the technology that we've used, not just for our purposes, but also to help the community and the government as well, is we've manufactured face masks. We have a fashion design department that has actually created traditional masks by sewing, using the sewing apparatus that they have. And they've created a few thousand masks for use, again, of healthcare workers, but also to some extent for staff and students. We also have access to 3D printing, and we've used those facilities to provide masks for the country, for the region, and for the university community as well. And finally, we have also volunteered our services. We do train, I should have mentioned, we do have healthcare students that we train. We have students that we train nurses, we train radiographers, pathology staff, medical laboratory staff, across the ambit of the medical or health sciences fraternity. And our students and staff have offered their services to the community and to other role players as well. And also, I think it goes without saying, this is adopted universally. We've also been participating in all levels of government, where we've actually provided the expertise in terms of the knowledge and academic rationale for some of the policy decisions which governs, but also education in particular. I'm going to move to my next slide. So as I mentioned, in order to create an intervention, you need support and you need guidance and leadership across all levels. The government has created various regulations. They've relaxed some of the regulations and stipulations they've had. They have created schedules and calendars. They've classified that can return and the timeframes for that. So that's on the regulations and the leadership point. So resourcing, the government itself has looked at providing laptops to students that do not have devices. They've also looked at providing connectivity in the form of mobile data for students that do not have data or contracts and so forth. I must also mention that the government itself is being advised and supported by key academics from the university fraternity. For example, an epidemiologist in South Africa is Professor Salim Karim, and he's actually helped the Department of Health and the government at large in terms of healthcare legislation, lockdown levels, social distancing norms, and so forth. And Professor Karim is actually from Durban, the same area that I come from, but he's from another university that's about 1 kilometer away from us. I'm going to move on. I'm not going to read the details in this particular slide because I'm sure that you'll be given the slide, but I just want to indicate to you legislation that has come from the government. Again, time is going away from us, so we don't want to dwell on this, but you'll see that flexibility, one of the key words that's used there, and other principles that I mentioned. The abbreviation WIL refers to work into, in other words, when students are placed in the work environment, you might be using a different term, internships and so on. So this is the first piece of legislation or regulation that has come through. And I'm going to move to the next slide. And then another key legislation or guideline that was provided is that we normally distinguish between contact education and distance education or online education. And this particular body, the Council, abbreviated CHE, has lifted the restrictions in light of the current pandemic. And then I was mentioning about the government interventions, and besides the government providing laptops and data for students, various institutions, my institution including, has been able to provide students with data and with laptop devices. I must emphasize here that for better or worse, the use of tablets was not viewed as a viable solution, because if students want to work on assignments and assessments and so on, a tablet will not be adequate. You may defer on that, but this is one of the decisions take the national and institutional level as well. Moving on. And then also just to mention that the Minister of Education has provided funding as well. So there's funding coming from all levels. And by the way, I should mention in passing that the staff at our university and across the country has been encouraged to their salary to help those that need. Our president, for example, pledged that he will donate 1/3 of his salary for 3 months to help all those that are in need, whether it be students, whether it be the public. And we are also doing that at the university as well, on a personal level and institutional level. Okay. In times like these, it's not appropriate to adopt a one-man approach or to behave as an island, so that we have a lot of collaborations with various university forums and associations to ensure a solution for our university, but across the entire sector. I'm going to move on. So I now want to get into the heart of the talk. Sorry about the long introduction. I think it was necessary. From the university's point then, from our university, and just quoting a few others as well, as I mentioned earlier, we've provided data, we've worked with students. Obviously, with these kinds of interventions, there's been issues with logistics, social distancing requirements, so forth. We are getting around those, but those issues remain. Logistical sometimes cannot be avoided, especially if you have health concerns. And data packages that I mentioned earlier as well. Something that was embedded in some of the requirements that I mentioned is the number of students. In other words, we didn't let all the students return at one time. Okay, so let's come to the main aspects of what we want today. So let's look at the teaching learning. So why I mentioned the background is that in order for to succeed, it was necessary for there to be leadership and resourcing from the governmental level, from the provincial, or what you might call a level, and then the university. If the university could have actually attempted to do everything on its own, but we would be limited in terms of resources, manpower, expertise, and so on. So it's within this framework in which we operate in, which makes things a bit easier for us, and sometimes it makes it more complicated. We've adopted an approach called multimodal teaching and learning, and I should also add assessment in that as well. If you principles I mentioned earlier is that we want to provide access to all students, large contract with us, so we tend to use them quite a bit. So Teams wasn't used previously, Moodle was used extensively, Blackboard also was used as well, but now we're using Moodle and MS Teams. On a platform, we can put videos, audio, graphics, software, text, notes, PowerPoints, whatever is required, the lecturers can design and put together will be available on this platform. But we realize that all students will not be able to access all this kind of data and all the type of multimedia because there are restrictions and requirements. Whereas we have provided laptops to students, we've been conscious don't have coverage because of connectivity issues. So we provided data, but notwithstanding provision of data, it might just be that very multimedia heavy solutions may not be appropriate for all students. So that's why we have a medium tech solution where we have social media platforms such as WhatsApp primarily, Facebook just as well, and others that I'm sure you'll be familiar with, other instant messaging systems as well. Here we provide video links, we will provide audio, pics and text. Videos itself, because they're quite bandwidth intensive, are not included in that solution. And then the low-tech solutions with material, the provision of all the media that I mentioned in the high-tech solution on USB sticks, and also text and graphics and so on as well. So the multimodal approach means that we will offer solutions because we realize the students are not all on the same level in terms of access to resources, data, internet connectivity, devices, and so on. As the government and the institutions provide laptops and data, we also realize that connectivity is something that cannot be sorted out and dealt with. So this has placed a burden on lecturers because it means sometimes you have to recreate material for all three of these that we're talking about. So it's multimodal. Yes, we will use all the technology, we'll use the media. What I mentioned earlier in the previous slide is that we're also looking at a phased return. So some students will be listened, but we want to minimize the contact. So we're using the technology solutions as well. In the past, we tend to only provide the high-tech solution. We didn't worry so much about medium solutions. We might have provided printers, but not necessarily place an emphasis on it. In the past, I think we knew that all students had access because they were on campus and they had use of the facilities, the lab facilities, library facilities, research facilities, and so on. Moving on. I'm not going to dwell on this. The institution has now looked at, so we talked about the approach. I want to look at the curriculum in particular. So the institution made some broad proposals that we can look at changing the way the programs and modules are delivered, the number of assessments or offering an alternative form of assessment. In other words, if we were looking at scheduling a test, we might now schedule an assignment or a mini project or a portfolio or something else that still keeps into account quality concerns, but is more appropriate mode of delivery, which is using online platforms or limited contact. We looked at wavering of prerequisites to some extent. This is from the university level. This is a broad-based proposal. I must emphasize it was a proposal, not an imposition. And then moving from examination-based assessments to continuous assessment. This term in the literature might have various interpretations. I'm not going to actually unpack that. We can deal with it in questions if you wish to. But normally with examination-based assessments that we had, we would have a regulated environment where students all attended a particular venue. And from there, you required, they were seated maybe a meter or so from each other. A pandemic, we are not able to do so. And we're not sure whether the cases will peter down by even September. So we've adopted this approach to say examinations for the first semester will be not held. We can use an alternative form. At the end of the year, we will revert back to examination-based assessments if and when required. Moving on to my next slide. Okay, so at the faculty level, so that was the institution's suggestions and proposals and what have we done at the faculty level? You'll probably see that there seems to be a repetition. Let me just explain this seeming discrepancy. Whilst the institution made proposals, faculties were given the option to choose from these various proposals as to which will be most appropriate, and they could also to use any of these suggestions. So in other words, they didn't have to change. So some faculties allowed departments and schools within the faculty to adapt these proposals and even provide counter proposals. So at the faculty level, there was leadership as well, where we were teaching the learning, the assessment on a very broad level, obviously. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Now, in designing, reconceptualizing the academic program, whether it be teaching, learning, and assessment, and the curriculum delivery. You can't ignore the teaching and learning paradigm and the various aspects that deal with teaching. The first point might seem a bit strange. It's considering the student historical profile and characteristics. Normally, when we do programs, we have to take into account the student's background. In other words, what is their family circumstances, what types of communities they come in, what circumstances have shaped their access to services and facilities, what kind of school they go to, what kind of school did they attend, was it private, was it public, what kind of resources was there. Now, you probably say, but look, this is something that we consider, so why do we include it here? I must say that I'm not saying it's true in all cases, but in some cases, we've people and they are acutely aware that it's required, but often they've played lip service to it. In other words, they said, yes, we should worry about where students have come from. In other words, the learning and the background that's assumed to be in place, but they didn't really pay enough attention to it. So what we've said now is that you've got to have a really concerted effort to make sure you consider the students. Hence, you will see in the previous slides, I mentioned the 3 levels of technology that we're using to cater for the student's background. Consideration of learning styles. I know that you're going to say, but look, this is what's new about this. Again, in some cases, we have not made adequate provision. I know that some of you that may have studied education will be aware of all the different types of education and learning styles. And we learn them theoretically, but we were not forced to actually make a real effort to provide learning materials, to provide teaching spaces, to provide facility that could cater for all students. We tend to focus a lot on the text, on the written materials, study guides, textbooks, and so forth. Now, if you look at the previous slide that I mentioned, you will see we have now said you must make provision for students, whether it be auditory learners, for those traditional learners, those that have a visual style, you've got to cater for all of them. And that's why part of the solution, next point, the customized media and learning materials to support teaching and learning, tied to all the students' learning styles. Adapting and customizing the curriculum and teaching styles. We know we have limited contact that's being allowed from in South Africa as of the beginning of, but also we're still dealing with online classrooms. And you'll appreciate that with an online environment, the benefit that you have of contact cannot be assumed to still be in place. And I think that goes without saying. So we've had to adapt the way that we approach, the way we organize the curriculum, moving content around, looking at the way we teach to actually cater for the students, and again, the environment, the type of learning styles. We also looked at disaggregating the students in classes in terms of technology levels, so that for all types of students, again, using the various platforms, but also splitting classrooms, changing the way we schedule a timetable, lessons, meeting in some cases, doing team teaching, group teaching, and so forth. And then the dissemination of learning materials. This is printed materials. We looked at providing it on USB for those that are tech savvy, but also printed materials for those that might have limited access to devices. Through it quite fast, but it's made sense, and we can unpack it if you require as we go through. That's primarily on the teaching, learning, and assessment. And now I want to come to amendments to the program. I'm going to skip to the next slide very quickly. Again, we have provided guidelines that will apply to all these faculties and departments, but at the same time, the flexibility has been a key consideration. Whilst we proposed at a macro level, we've also allowed faculties and departments to use their discretion and their academic expertise to look at what's best for the student, look at the facilities, look at resources, adopt solutions and design solutions, whether it be learning material, whether it be the way the lectures and lessons are delivered, or the technology we use, so that they can adapt they could change. You don't have to actually work on a very rigid and system that is imposed. They can actually change it as required. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to move to the next slide to unpack what we've mentioned. And I think some of these terms may be a bit odd or strange, but I'll speak to them as. Okay, we're still okay for time, so let me just move on. Okay, we're not going to be much longer. The amendments to program categories, and within the pandemic scenario that we're in, as I mentioned earlier, we looked at a system to cater for changes in the number of assessments, contents, in other words, rearranging the contents, prioritizing different things, moving around, considering the number of students in classes, looking at the prescribed books, and if prescribed books cannot be provided or no longer in the material cannot be sourced, providing e-books through our library system, changing the way we deliver, again, from contact to online, using a mixed approach where it's a mix of contact in some cases, whilst adopting social distancing norms, changing from semester to annual, revised time, changing the assessment methodology, what I mentioned earlier, examination, continuous assessment. Now, why I'm mentioning it here is that we have a system to deal with these kind of changes in an efficient manner, but at the same time, we don't want to sacrifice quality and academic integrity of the program whilst we want to make a process as efficient as possible. Okay, so let me just show you what the project. I apologize for the use of acronyms here. The CQPA department, quite a difficult acronym to remember. Most of our colleagues get it wrong because of all the consonants, I guess. The committee that you're probably familiar with is each faculty. We have 6 faculties. It has a faculty board structure. And the faculty board structure will make decisions on these changes that will be proposed. Again, in terms of learning materials, that can be handled at departmental level. When it comes to restructuring the program process that will have to be followed. We've made the process efficient. Whilst we have all these committees, we've actually scheduled multiple meetings, online Microsoft Teams meetings, to actually deal with it. So we don't have to have a physical meeting for this to happen. We have a subcommittee which is made up of a small number of members that will deal with all these kinds of changes. And then finally, our apex body that deals with academic programs and making is our Senate, and to some extent our Senex, the executive committee. And these kinds of decisions will flow through these committees. At the same time, we have allowed flexibility across faculties, across departments, and we've also allowed considerations, because that's my business, quality management, quality assurance, to make sure that we don't, in trying to deliver a service, that we don't skimp on the content and we don't relax our requirements so much so that we deliver an inferior product, an inferior academic program that'll have lasting ramifications for graduates and students when they enter the workplace. So we accurately aware of maintaining standards, but having flexibility and having enough wherewithal to ensure that we deliver a program, but within certain norms and standards. With those closing remarks, I'd like to bring this presentation to a close, and then I'll hand you back to the data, and we can then take some questions. Let me go to my last slide. Just some pictures from our university, and I would like to once again offer my profound thanks for this opportunity. And I really thank the institution and coordinators for to speak. I know I've been mostly experiential in terms of what has been done. I haven't really looked at conceptual frameworks and theoretical underpinning, but if time permits now, we can unpack that as required. I thank you for your time, and I'm going to stop my presentation and hand you back to the coordinator. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Mr. Noor, for the wonderful presentation. It really awakened us to know exactly about the redefining of teaching, learning, and evaluation systems that are happening in South African institutions. And now, this session is open for discussion. Participants can send your questions in chat box and kindly remain in mute. All your questions will be raised by me and answered by our guest. Meanwhile, feedback form is in the chat box and at the end of the session and in comment box in YouTube live session. Participants, you can raise your questions in chat box. So we are actually receiving positive comments from.
Thank you, everybody.
Is there any participants, you can post the questions in the, yeah. So we are receiving the questions. I'll raise to the guest by one. Norman, that's the question.
Okay. If you don't,
yeah.
If you could repeat them, I can't follow all the.
No, I know. Yeah. I'll ask for you. I'll randomly and I'll raise to you.
Okay, I saw a question on rotation, but okay, it just popped in and out. I'm not sure if there were others on rotation of lecturers, and then I see also another one. Should I answer that question on rotation of lecturers, or was there a question before that?
Yeah, you can.
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, there would be provision. Sorry, not should I say they should be, would be. There is provision for rotation of lecturers so that we don't share the same spaces. We isolate or maintain social distancing norms. So everybody will not be in the classroom at the same time. And even in the departmental facilities, there will be maintenance of social distancing. So we have timetables and schedules that we use, and we ensure that a venue is not used. And maybe just as an aside, after a venue is used, it will be sanitized and cleaning will take place to ensure that if there's any infections that they do not spread. But yes, are rotated and they're divided because at this stage, all staff, maybe I should have mentioned that, have not returned. Some of the staff, including myself, for example, are working from home, and we're using online systems as far as possible. That is what has been encouraged. So, but again, in time, within the next 2 months or so, everybody will return. But yes, a rotation and schedules will be used and maintained quite regularly. Thank you. Next question, please.
Yeah, that's a question, interesting question. In India, many students are from rural background. How the faculty can facilitate them through online teaching modes is not have necessary accessories to use them.
Okay. Thank you for that question as well. The student population in the Durban University of Technology has a large cohort of students come from rural backgrounds, very much in some ways like India. In other ways, in fact, the restrictions and the lack of coverage is even more pronounced. That is why I mentioned we looked at low-tech solutions. We looked at providing printed materials that will be couriered or delivered to students. And we looked at providing laptops as well for students to use. And students also use, we have residence for our students as well, some of the students that require residence. So they could return and use the facilities that are there, facilities. But for those students that remain in rural areas, we are going to deliver the materials to them in two forms, in USB form and also, and as I said, the rollout of laptops has commenced. Data packages have been provided. One issue that it's almost impossible for us to deal with is that in certain flung rural areas, it's almost impossible to guarantee coverage. So the problem with that, if it's closer to the city centers within maybe 100, 200 kilometers is fine, but any further than that within our province, it does become a challenge for students. And especially if the terrain is quite hilly or there's mountains in place, it becomes the coverage. That is why I said we've looked at printed materials and providing in the laptops that they require as well. But it's not a perfect solution. So that's the only thing we could think of to mitigate that is to provide printed materials in addition at no cost to the students.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. And there's another question regarding the research students who are into research. What are the challenges students will face as far as research is concerned? And what steps can be taken to overcome them during this pandemic?
Okay, thank you for that. That is quite. Initially, we were a bit naive, and we assumed that with research students, postgraduate students, that it will be business as usual, and they'll be able to proceed. But what became apparent quite soon is that some of those students require access to our specialized facilities, laboratory equipment, and so on, and that will not happen. So they were not able to use, I'm saying at the outset of the pandemic when we had a complete lockdown of the country. So they do not have, again, we assume that they can proceed as normal, but that students that are gathering data and still need to verify results and to use specialized analytical equipment and so on, or for example, using software like Atlas TI or NVivo or whatever others that are required, and they did not have them on their home machines, an issue for us as well. I guess the students that were, it depends on which phase of research. Those students that were now doing analysis, they had the tools, they had the laptops, they had the software. By the way, DAT provides the software for students for analysis, SPSS, NVivo, Atlas TI, and so on, and for referencing to students on their personal devices. And they have access to the library across the web as well. So if they were in write-up stage where they were doing analysis using software that they had, that was provided by DUT at their conclusions, and they were dealing with the supervisors, that wasn't affected. It was just those students that were maybe in phase 1, phase 2, data collection, or maybe needed equipment for verification or tools that they do not have on their personal devices or at home, they didn't access. What actually happened is about a month after the lockdown, we did allow on a phased or rotation basis equipment and facilities after each use. Thank you.
Thank you for the response. We have another interesting question raised by Dr. Shamila. So some students are unable to report online. Any suggestions for other modes of assessment, for example, reassessments, to be taken in later semesters, etc.? Is it advisable? They may not be able to get the evaluation on time. Okay.
As I mentioned, we've allowed for flexibility. What has happened is, and again, I don't want to, we can go into the academic merits of it. One of the major changes that we looked at, again, suggestion cases at faculty at institutional level, is to look at moving more towards a continuous assessment approach. And I didn't mention the details here, but what we have done for a semester, the semester closes at a particular time. Now, normally our semester would close, the first semester would close in July. So if you take the continuous assessment approach and also the flexibility, we're not closing the timeframes. What we've actually done is, so marks can be captured and assessments can be held throughout the year. For the first semester, we're also looking at going into January of next year. And then the continuous assessment approach allows lecturers to use any other method that they see. So they could change what they're doing, and also they could use other methods that are more appropriate for offline. For example, using assignment, ask the students to create portfolios. As an example, we have photography students, and what the lecturers looked at there is to, because they can't create the photographs and videos to the same extent, they've looked at the requirements for the portfolio. So for online, we have drama students as well. What the lecturers have done there, obviously it doesn't help you with teamwork as such or cooperative work, but they've looked at recording themselves, doing soliloquies and verbal recordings, and providing that. And also when the contact starts, which is in June, they'll be able to carry on with the rest of the work. So it's a mixed approach of contact and offline. Something about what is preferable. I think in light of South African restrictions, which are still in place, we are still not completely open because of the pandemic. We have adopted a mix. So yes, we're using limited contact and we're using online, which is best, I think, given the circumstances. We don't really have much of a choice in terms of what approach we should use. Thank you.
So I would like
Are there any other
state,
questions?
no more questions, Norman.
Okay, thank you.
And I would like to state Werner Howard's quote that always walk through life, something new to learn and you will. Gratitude is the fairest blossom which springs from our soul. I take this opportunity to show my gratitude to the management team of our institution, the head of the institution, Dr. Prem Nazir sir, for the support rendered and to organize of this event. Leaders become great not because of their power, but because of their ability to empower others. To Norman Ronald for empowering us with your presentation. I thank from the bottom of my heart the co-convener of this event, Dr. Kamal Raj Sir, Head Department of BCA of our institution, who extended his technical support and excellency to make this event successful. Our Controller of Examination, Dr. Kadresan, who joined with us in this session. I also thank my associates, Ms. Trinu, Mr. Sridev Sir, Dr. Devi, and Dr. Sivaranjani, who shared their shoulder in all aspects of the conduct of this session. Not least, I extend my thanks to all the participants for accepting the invitation and actively participating in today's session. Your presence and involvement makes the session wonderful. Once again, I thank you all. Thank you, Norman, for joining with us. Shareable time.
Okay. Thank you, Doc, and thanks once again to all the participants and the organizers for such a session and for your patience with myself in particular. And I wish you all everything the best and just keep safe and healthy. And I trust that we will all be able to go through this pandemic together and come out on the other side. Best wishes and thank you once again.
Thank you, Norman. We can close the session. Norman, you can
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
take it with you. Participants can fill the feedback form. The feedback form is posted in the chat box.